Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio.
It's great to have you here today. We've been on the show before, and I know you come from a journalism background, Andy. Maybe tell us a little bit about that era if you like, because I find in the ancient mystery genre there's a handful of researchers out there come from a journalism background, and I find this an incredible skill set to take on ancient mysteries because of the researchers that they naturally are. And you find archaeologists do well, astronomers do well, historians do well. However, journalism is a key skill set for this ancient mystery genre that has really developed in the last 20 years. So maybe tell us a little bit about that early part of your life, Andrew, and then we'll get into some of your work and your books.
Okay, well, for me, I think my active participation in the mysteries began when I was invited to join a brand new magazine called Strange Phenomena in 1979. It meant me leaving my home territory of Essex and going up to live in the Midlands. But myself and a colleague there, Graham Phillips, set to work on creating this magazine, and it didn't do very well in the sense that we only actually brought out 2 issues, but we were at it for over a year and a half. I was suddenly plunged into writing about lots and lots of different things, everything from orgone energy of Wilhelm Reich to witchcraft to the occult, paranormal, poltergeist, ley lines, all sorts of things that we had to write, features on. And we also got to know a whole load of people in the subject in all of these different areas, the key figures, some of them were contributors in the magazine. And that really kicked things off for me because there are a number of ventures that took place whilst we were there, some of them involving psychic activity. Mm-hmm. And this inspired me to write about ancient history and the mysteries of the past in general. But from there I went to work for a local newspaper in Essex called the Evening Echo. From there to another paper just started called the Leeds Times. And for several years I worked on these papers on every area, not just journalism, but advertising, the construction, the layout of the papers. And it taught me all I needed to know, not just about how to write stories quickly, efficiently, and to get stories, how to get stories in the first place, how to get in through the back door, basically, when you're looking to get the exclusive and whatever. But it also gave me the background to how to publish, because all my original books were self-published. They started off at 200 copies, 300 copies, and then moved to 1,000, then 2,500. And then in 1988, I brought out a book called The Black Alchemist, which I, for some stupid reason, decided that I would get 15,000 copies done. And the money needed, I actually bought a house and then used that as collateral, to borrow the money to actually produce these books. And so, in other words, everything rode on the success of this book. And over the next 2 years, I was able to sell every single copy. And at the end of that period, I was still selling 30 copies per month in many leading W.H. Smith branches. Wow. And at that point, publishers started to realise that there was this person self-publishing, getting all this attention with this book, and that was Random House, and they took me on at that point, and the rest is history, so to speak. So the importance, I think, of local journalism and working on newspapers is it gives you an incredible background into everything you need to know about not just writing, but investigative practices, and also the publishing, and promotion and the publicity and things, all of these things that are crucially necessary for the success in this business. I mean, there was no social media back in those days, sure. So you couldn't, or internet, of course. So you couldn't generate your own interest in that manner. You had to do it through the good old local papers and national papers and whatever. And everything I did after, somehow I managed to get into national papers or on television or something through some kind of not so much publicity stunt, but knowing how to manipulate the media to get attention. And in 1 year with The Black Alchemist, I got 8 front page leads in local papers because of the promotion that I did. And it sold books, obviously, in the bucket load.
Wow, incredible, interesting, Andrew, because you came at a time that was pioneering to be self-publishing. Nowadays it's so simple.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess then, Andrew, I think one major book for you, From the Ashes of Angels, kind of catapulted you. Obviously you were in the genre of a professional science writer at that time, a professional history writer.
Well, it's not so much, really. I mean, up until that point, my books had been what I call psychic questing books, and or local history books. I mean, just about a local town or village and its mysteries. I mean, I produced a few of those. Yeah. But what I wanted to do was to get into more serious writing. And I realised that that to do this, there'd have to be a transition in writing style. So I started to write From the Ashes of Angels, which essentially is the idea that somewhere in the area of southeast Turkey, which is the cradle of civilization and also the place of the Garden of Eden in biblical tradition, something big happened around the end of the last ice age. Probably the incoming of a certain elite who were shamans, probably extremely advanced, took over the local communities and created the genesis of civilization. That's basically what the book's about. And that these were human beings, a little different to you or I, maybe slightly taller, but that are described in mythology as the Shining Ones, the Elohim, the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, names like this. And that, that's what that book was about. And it was published in 1996, when it was published by Penguin in the UK. And I do remember taking the original manuscript to the publisher, or certainly the first several chapters, and I actually didn't like them. They basically said they were too dry, and that I had to, try and rewrite them, and I got a massive headache rewriting those and the rest of the book in a very, very short space of time at a very traumatic period of my life as well. But it was a dark period, but the book, sort of said it all eventually when it was published, and it really sort of set me up as a major figure in the ancient mysteries field. At a time when people like Graham Hancock and Robert Bouval, and also figures like Robert Schoch were beginning to come into the picture, and John Anthony West, all his ideas to do with the ageing of the Sphinx and whatever, all of these were happening at the same time, and I was able to get onto that bandwagon, if you like, and become a part of that ancient mysteries movement. And luckily, I was accepted into it, by the others. I mean, I remember at one point, the first ever lecture I gave on the subject of From the Ashes of Angels, in the audience was Graham Hancock, Robert Bouval, John Anthony West, and various other key figures. And they were overrunning massively, and the period of my talk was getting squeezed, more and more squeezed, as far as the time slot available. And, I almost panicked, but I got it over, and the rest is history, as it were.
Incredibly interesting times when we talk about the ancient histories movement, and really the dynamic that research is just, everybody's at it now. Everybody's wanting to write books and research this material, to read about this. And like you say, you held your own back in, mid-90s, Andrew. I guess maybe to talk about the Nephilim for a moment, because they're quite a hot topic and a little hot potato to talk about these days, and like you say, you've been doing that since the mid-90s.
Yeah.
Maybe lend credence to the article you have about Greg Little's Path of Souls book. Maybe just bring that in at that point, since that we're on the Nephilim.
Okay, well, the book The Path of Souls, which is authored by my friend and colleague Greg Little, was a book which we talked about doing together, and to be honest, I wish we could have done it fully together, but I just did not get the chance, and he wanted to bring it out super quick. But I contributed sections to it, and my name's there on the cover for that reason. And amongst those sections, and bear in mind the book itself is about the absolute investigation of the giant skeletons, which a lot of people popularly refer to as the Nephilim today. Although I must point out this term is probably quite erroneous, because the Nephilim are the offspring of the Watchers in Hebrew tradition, and that's a purely Near Eastern or Middle Eastern phenomena, and in all honesty I would not connect directly those Nephilim with, let's say, the American giants as far as their background and who they actually are, but that's pedantics at this time. But what Greg Little wanted to do was to get to the bottom of it. He'd been working for years on this subject and have mounted hundreds of reports, not simply from newspaper cuttings from the 19th or early 20th century, but actual scholarly reports in Smithsonian, journals, and in other archaeological things. And he wanted to put all of that material together. And so part of my contribution was to try and understand exactly what these giant skeletons were, not just found in America but in other parts of the world, but focusing on those in America. And I cottoned on to the idea, basically through working with a friend of mine whose name is Debbie Cartwright, who's a very inspired, intuitive, visionary person, that there was a connection between the recently discovered Homo subspecies or hominin known as the Denisovans, whose physical fossil remains have been found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia only within the past 10 years. And DNA evidence has shown that they are unrelated to our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, and that there existed, therefore, if you want to call it a race or a population of people, mostly in Eastern Asia, who we had no absolute knowledge about at all, and that there was a connection between those and the American giants. And the reason for this is quite clear, and that's the fact that of the small amount of anatomical evidence that's found of the Denisovans, the teeth, the two molars have been found, that they're essentially twice the size of normal, human teeth.
Highly indicative.
And which suggests that, firstly, they must have had very large skulls or jaws to have fitted these in. But the other interesting factor is that the Denisovans almost certainly derived from a much older hominin known as Homo heidelbergensis. And Homo heidelbergensis was the precursor to both the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. And in 2013 it was announced that 400,000-year-old remains found in a cave shelter in Spain had been analysed and the DNA data tested, and it was found that the mitochondrial DNA was closer to the Denisovans than it was to the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were the inhabitants of Europe and Western Asia before us Homo sapiens came in around 45,000 years ago.
Wow.
And this was a complete surprise to anthropologists and prehistorians, whatever, because they'd expected these remains from this cave in France, which is the Cima de la Huasos, I think is the. Excuse any Spanish-speaking people out there that watch this. Anyway, that they'd expected this DNA results to have shown that it was more closely related to Neanderthals, but it confirmed that these Homo heidelbergensis were more closely linked with the Denisovans. That's what the evidence seemed to point towards. And the significance there is that the Homo heidelbergensis people came out of Africa, as obviously in theory, all of these different hominins did at some point, and that regularly the remains of Homo heidelbergensis found in South Africa are over 7 feet tall. In other words, they were giants. So we can see this line coming down from the Homo heidelbergensis through the Denisovans, and then through hybridisation, which we know took place between Denisovans and modern humans, because many different populations in Eastern Asia and in Ireland, Southeast Asia, the areas of, let's say, Borneo, Java, and even as far east as northern Australia, Papua New Guinea, have up to 6% Denisovan DNA. Once they obviously recognised that Denisovan DNA was real, they could see it there within our own DNA. But more importantly, there was DNA from the Denisovans in the Native Americans, which showed that, if not the Denisovans themselves, hybrids, Denisovan human hybrids, reached the Americas. Now, I proposed in Path of Souls that the giant skeletons, the so-called Nephilim, were Denisovan human hybrids, and this was published in June 2014, and I believe I was the first person to put the whole thing together with all of the evidence and much more, and a lot of people are taking this up now in the scholarly world, in the popular media. Many other researchers are beginning to write about it, and I think this is actually going to be a very, very important key question in the future. Clearly the American giants and the skeletons found is something which I'm very interested in myself. I'm writing about it again in a new book which has the working title of Hybrid Origins.
Oh, wow.
And this is in theory being written at the moment and will be published in theory next year. So, watch out for that. And that will be the entire story that I've told you here. Plus, it will be looking at the importance of hybridisation in other parts of the world, particularly, for instance, how it came to influence the construction of Gobekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, which was in the precise area that I predicted that some kind of incoming elite had kick-started the genesis of civilization in From the Ashes of Angels. And then in the year 2000 it was announced that Gobekli Tepe had been found right in the centre of where I'd been talking about, and that was one of the reasons why I got onto Gobekli Tepe really quickly. But the reason why it's important here is that in my most recent book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, I suggest that the founders of Gobekli Tepe were in fact Neanderthal human hybrids, who are known to archaeology as the Swiderians, and that they came down from the north, from the area of Russia, central Russia, and the Ukraine, and that they were part of a population that stretched all the way from the Carpathian Mountains in the west to the rivers Volga and Don in the east in Russia. And that these were an incredibly advanced people, shamans, tool specialists, traders, astronomer priests, and they had a heritage and tradition that stretched back already 20, maybe even 30,000 years, and that the origins of this was within this hybridization, which I think took place, if not in central Russia, further east, maybe as far as the Ural Mountains or the Altai Mountains of Siberia, where the first evidence of the Denisovan people were found. So it's all a bigger picture here, which, comes together in a nice way.
I think the complexity that you're talking and addressing, Andrew, is something that's not other authors have done. I mean, when you look at Gobekli Tepe, I think a lot of people have focused on the astronomy or focused on the megalithic monuments and construction. You have tackled the question of who done it, the big who done it, and you've done it really well in academic and in research. To focus on then the whodunit, the Swiderians, for example, we label them as the Swiderians, but if they're a hybrid Denisovans with Neanderthals, are we talking then like a hybrid human, call them Swiderians for the sake of it, with a mix of brain power, a mix of artistic expression? What mix there? Is it just a physical, for example, spirituality, cosmology, language, artistic expression, all these things are going to be the result of a hybrid. No?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's important here is okay, we ourselves are hybrid. We're all hybrids. I mean, anybody that came out of Africa and settled on the Eurasian continent is a hybrid either of Neanderthals. We have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in us, that's now known, or in Eastern Asia, probably a small percentage of Denisovans, because the Neanderthals were in the West, the Denisovans were in the East. Mm-hmm. Before those two, there were much earlier antecedents, such as the Homo heidelbergensis. That's one of the key, proto-human forms that existed in the Eurasian and African continent. But the significance is the fact that quite clearly these different populations developed over many hundreds of thousands of years. So their brain type, their physicality, their way of life was completely different. Okay, it would appear as if our own Homo sapien ancestors were much more survivalist, rationalistic, conquerors when we first entered into Europe and Western Asia. That seems to be our main motive. Whereas the Neanderthals, from all the evidence, and one of the guys that put all this together many years ago was the writer Stan Gush, and we really need to thank him for looking at the whole idea of hybridation in a number of books he did from the 1960s through to his death, I think in 2010. But I mean, what he basically showed is that the Neanderthal mind, from all the evidence that we have, would seem to suggest that they were much more dreamers. They were much more into perfectionists, and their world was much more linked with the other world all the time. In other words, they were daydreamers, if you like. They may have even been nocturnalists, coming out at night as well. They seem to have had a special interest in the moon and the effects of the moon on menses and the creation of life and gestation and things like this. And they seem to have had a primitive form of spirituality, which was very important, because when they came together with our own human ancestors, it created an entirely different mindset. Now it was somebody who, aside from their physical difference, because the Neanderthals were quite small, they had no foreheads, they had no chins, they had very heavy, thick brow ridges, they were quite stocky, big boned and whatever. But whereas the Homo sapiens were a lot taller, broader faced, but the admixture of them created something different anyway, something which I think was remembered very strongly in myths and legends as the Shining Ones and whatever. But as far as the brain is concerned, suddenly us as rationalists and survivalists and conquerors, the rest of it, suddenly had this new import of ideas relating to art and connections with the other world, through something that we now might call shamanism. And we utilised it. Thought, oh my God, we've got all these new things that we can play with, and it created a new human type of hominin, a new type of human creature, if you like, which was one that was suddenly advanced in many, many different ways. Because at this point, suddenly we get all of the Ice Age cave art suddenly flourishing, which had not been there before. Mm-hmm. And there is some indication, particularly at the very earliest cave sites, such as Chauvet in the Ardèche region of southern France, that as the incredible cave art was being created there 32,000 years ago, or thereabouts, that Neanderthal children were walking through those caves and leaving their footprints in the soft mud. Now, what the hell were Neanderthals doing there when all of this beautiful cave art was being created? And I mean, not just for no good reason, easily. Clearly they were creating some underground cathedral, Ice Age cathedral. So what are Neanderthals doing there? And I think the most likely explanation is that these weren't necessarily created by Neanderthals. I think that almost certainly they were created by hybrids of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that there was still a connection with their ancestors, their Neanderthal ancestors, that was still present there at the time. And the same thing is found at many different sites on the Eurasian continent and also in Africa. That if you look at the layers of cultural activity, you have the Neanderthal presence there with their specific stone traditions, which are known as the Mousterian. And suddenly there's a point where clearly Homo sapien tools start appearing and the Neanderthal tools stop. And the incoming Homo sapien tools are equally, accomplished, but they're not brilliant. Mm-hmm. And then the next layer is the most incredible sophisticated tools being uncovered. And I think quite clearly what this is showing is that the incoming Homo sapien community or population has now interbred with the pre-existing Neanderthal community, and this has given them an entirely new mindset. And now they're creating this most incredible precision art for the first time. And I think that one of the best examples of this in Europe is the so-called Solutrean culture. They came onto the scene around 25,000 years ago and stuck around until around 17,000 years ago. They created the first stone blocks with carved art of animals and human figures on them. They possibly even got on boats and went to America. There's evidence that they may have been behind the so-called Clovis culture in America. But most significantly is that their stone tools are the most sophisticated ever that had been created. And they were producing lance heads that were about 14 inches tall, but only half an inch, possibly even a quarter of an inch in thickness. And they look like beautiful faceted jewels made out of crystals, exotic minerals like amethyst, obsidian and things like this. Why did they suddenly start to create these? And I think it's because now these hybrids have got a new mindset where they don't just want to create nice tools to be functional anymore. The functionality idea has almost gone out the window. Now they're creating things for beauty.
Aesthetics as well as their function.
And absolute precision beauty. In other words, they're not just going to spend 10 hours on making a tool, they're going to spend 100 hours on making a tool. And this is something that was not there prior to the interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Andrew, we'll come back to Gobekli Tepe in a moment, but if you look at the period 10,000 BC, Gobekli Tepe, and then back to 50,000 BC, and you mentioned the groups, the Sudarians, Neanderthals, the Nosophians, Solutreans, the Clovis culture, we really have to, and I'm glad you brought up the Peshmerga, Ardesh, Chauvet caves as well. This is in that region, in that epoch of our origins, and these groups of people. We have to rewrite the history, not only that, of who these people are, we have to rethink and we have to give these guys credit because of their sophistication.
We do. And as I said, we also have to give credit to Stan Gush because he was the guy that kept saying that what we call civilization today comes from the Neanderthals. And, I would advise all of the viewers here to go out and buy books by Stan Gush. Because, he had it all as early as the 1960s and people just ignored him because the evidence just wasn't there for Neanderthal-human hybridization at that time.
Or sophistication.
No, not really. Well, the sophistication was there, but the thing is the Darwinian attitude of evolution, of human evolution in particular, suggests that we get better the further time goes on because we learn through experience. And we evolve in that way, which to a degree is correct. But what it doesn't take into account is what happens when you put two different human species together and create hybrids, how the brain suddenly advances and accelerates to such a degree that it's almost like having a completely different type of species in front of you.
I grew up being taught that Neanderthal was a dummy, and that's not my fault. That's just what the academic institution believed or thought.
Well, even today, the term Neanderthal is used for somebody who's stupid and does stupid things. And I think that this is a travesty to the memory of the Neanderthals, because I think in many ways they may actually have been cleverer, and I think this is the right word, than Homo sapiens.
Yeah, I did see a documentary to say that they may have even been a musical race. They may have even had musical instruments from bones.
Yeah, and in other words, it may well be that we gained ideas relating to music from them. And the other important thing is that there are certain genetic markers, both within the Denisovans and in the Neanderthals, which suggest that they were more prone to autism. Now, autism is something which we know, in one way retards a person in certain social skills and whatever, but in other ways creates them into these weird geniuses relating to, mathematics and memory and vision and whatever, and seeing things. So if you put this into the mix, that just possibly the Neanderthals and the Denisovans had these certain ideas going on as well, how does that come into play when hybridization takes place? That's something that, I'd like to get to grips with, and I probably will at least try within this next book.
So to focus on Gobekli Tepe, anybody that has looked at Gobekli Tepe can undoubtedly see the sophistication in the artistic expression, the carvings, the 3D carvings that are kind of carved or embossed onto these T-shaped pillars that are 15 tons. Incredible sophistication. So whoever built this, we call them Swiderians today, these guys had to be sophisticated. Whoever did this are sophisticated. Tell me about your research into Gobekli Tepe, why this started. I know this was with the Cygnus mystery, so maybe we can focus on the Cygnus mystery and then we'll lead back into Gobekli Tepe.
Okay. Well, I was alerted to the discovery of Gobekli Tepe in the year 2000. Prior to this, I'd already brought out 2 books that were directly relevant, one being From the Ashes of Angels in 1996, and the second being Gods of Eden in 1998. And by the time I'd come to do Gods of Eden, I'd realised that there was high culture, extreme high culture in the area of southeast Turkey. I knew about a site called Nevali Chori, which is actually a little to the north of what we now know as Gobekli Tepe. And there, incredible rectilinear stone pillars were discovered that were anthropomorphic, with arms down their side, found within this what they call a cult building, possibly some kind of enclosure where the first gods or the ancestors were venerated. And when I first saw the remaining pillar right in the centre of this cult building at Nevali Chori, which was one of 2, there had been another one next to it, these twin monoliths, just like we would eventually find at Gobekli Tepe. I remember looking at that and just thinking, it's the monolith out of 2001, A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
I mean, it just had exactly the same proportions. It was like the same idea that here was something completely out of place to what we are told about the level of progress and evolution of the people in the area. This was incredibly out of place. So I wrote about that in Gods of Eden and went into detail. I contacted the archaeologists involved. So I was aware of this culture. But then 2 years later, in the year 2000, Gobekli Tepe was announced to the world. And this was Nevali Chori times 10, basically. And what Gobekli Tepe is, of course, is this huge megalithic complex on the summit of a mountain in southeast Turkey. There are 4 main circles of stone which where the stones are actually not, edge, wide faces facing the centre, like stone circles, like Stonehenge, for instance, but edge on, like the like a clock face, basically, radiating spirals, not spirals, but radiating from a central position towards these huge twin monoliths. And the oldest of these enclosures are around 11,500 years old. And the largest stones are probably 15, 20 tonnes as erected at the moment, as tall as about 18.5 feet. Obviously it's just incredible stuff. And we know about this site now. We know that this is almost like the smoking gun of a lost civilization, that clearly all of this didn't happen overnight. This is the end product of something that had been building up for thousands of years. So what was the lost civilization? I was aware of all of this, and I had the opportunity in 2004 to go out to southeast Turkey to do a lecture based on the fact that my books, From the Ashes of Angels and a couple of others, were being published over there for the first time. And I basically said, look, as part of the deal, could I get out to some of these sites? So they gave me a driver and an interpreter for a week, and we were just able to just go out to all of these sites, including Gobekli Tepe, and another site called Cheonu, went to the ancient city of Haran, and many, many other places, and a brand new site that we found out about just whilst I was there called Karahan Tepe, which I've since been back to just within the last year. Mm-hmm. And this showed this incredibly sophisticated culture from 11 or 11,500 years ago. But whilst I was at Gobekli Tepe, I remember looking at the incredible carvings at these stones, and bear in mind that there was nobody there, no one. The only people that we saw was a farmer and his son that came over, and they were the people that had first reported the discovery of carved pieces of fragment found, in the soil of the fields there. Because, then they tried to report this to the local museum and they hadn't taken any notice. And it took Professor Klaus Schmidt coming there in 1994 to recognise the significance of this occupational mound of earth, which, by the way, is not native to the spot, would have to have been brought up from the valleys below and placed on the top of this limestone, rocky, mountain summit, by the way. And so I was there, and I remember just trying to think, what the hell was these people into? I mean, why were they creating things like this? I had no idea at that point. And I just wanted to try and get inside their mindset. That was what I was trying to do. And I came away from there, and over the next few days, the Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Haran, which is this ancient city of the star worshippers and moon worshippers, known as the Sabians, was right on the plain below Gobekli Tepe, and all of this was just going round my head. And about 2 or 3 days later, we was at myself and my ex-wife were at some friends, and they were talking about whatever, and my head was completely there. It was in southeast Turkey, and I remember the next day coming home, and just that night, just my head just exploded with information, because I suddenly realised that the enclosures of Gobekli Tepe were focused towards the north, exactly the same as the beliefs of many of the local populations in that area were focused on stars in the northern night sky. In particular, the pole star. The Sabian peoples of Haran, for instance, venerated the north as the place of the primal cause. And they saw it as the place where souls come from and return to in death. It's the place of God, the place of the cosmic energy and whatever. Other peoples like the Yazidi angel worshippers also venerated the pole star these peoples known as the Mandaeans, who were an offshoot of the Sabians. They venerated the North Pole Star as well. There was even a Shiite Muslim sect known as the Brethren of Purity in Syria, who are directly connected with the Sabians, who also venerated the North. They had their North altar in the North, all the rest of it. And I wondered whether the people at Gobekli Tepe were also focused on the northern night sky. And if so, what were they looking at? It certainly wasn't the pole star, because there was no pole star around 9,100 BC. There was just, there wasn't one. There was no bright star near what we call the celestial pole, the pivot of the celestial heavens, for them to recognise the pole star. So what else might they have been interested in? And I realised that one of the key symbols associated with the Gobekli Tepe culture was the vulture. Mm-hmm. They'd seen this as a symbol of the transition of the soul from this world to the next, and that the vulture was what the Greeks referred to as a psychopomp to them. Yeah. It was either the bird that accompanied the soul into the next world, or the soul actually became a vulture. And this wasn't just the souls of the dead, but also the souls of shaman who would adorn themselves in vulture garb, paraphernalia, the claws and the feather coats and things like this, which had been found not only in physical evidence of these bird wings and things like that as part of this culture, the early Neolithic culture in this region, but also there were many depictions on the walls. Navali Chori, for instance, there were statues and things like this found of vultures in the Neolithic city of Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey, which is the same culture but a few thousand years later on. Loads of images of vultures on the walls, vulture shamans and whatever, but also at Çatalhöyük imagery of what is known as excarnation, and that's where the birds, the vultures, would be allowed to come down and peck clean human bodies that were put out on special towers, which later became known in Zoroastrian tradition as towers of silence. And the birds would come down, pick the bodies clean and go off. And that's the reason why the bird became associated with the soul, because it was seen that this whole process was happening on two levels. On the physical level, that the birds picking the bodies clean, but on the other level, once the birds flew off, they were taking the souls with them towards the other world. And this wasn't something that they created. The idea of the soul being associated with a bird is unquestionably of Paleolithic origin and goes back probably 20, 30,000 years. And in different parts of the world, different birds take this role. Mostly in the Eurasian continent, it's the swan or some wild fowl like a goose or something like this that is the bird of the soul. The crane is another bird. And in much later tradition, it becomes a more softer in something like the dove or the pigeon or something like this. But originally it was much more fiercer birds that took this role. Obviously in America, things like the thunderbird and the eagle and things like this. But at Gobekli Tepe, it was the vulture. And I thought to myself, is the vulture associated with any constellations? And I looked, and the most obvious constellation it was associated with was the constellation of Lyra, the musical instrument up in the sky. But for some reason, I didn't feel this was quite right. But next to it, overlaid on the Milky Way, at the point where the Milky Way splits, and at a point that's been seen as a point of entry and exit into the sky world, I would say since Paleolithic times, was the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, which is mostly seen as a swan, but it was also once seen as a vulture. And it was at that point that my head exploded, and I scribbled notes for about the next 5 or 6 hours. The sun had come up, and I had the basis of what would eventually become the Cygnus mystery. And I was convinced, therefore, that the people at Gobekli Tepe had focus their attentions not just on the northern night sky, but the brightest star in the constellation of Cygnus, which is Deneb. And at that point, I began to find that all the way around the world, from Egypt to Britain, at places like Avebury, in America, North America, at Hopewell sites, at
Olmecs, the central.
and the Olmecs as well, all the way around the world, was references that nobody really had put together that suggested that Cygnus was a very, very important constellation in the past and was seen as the destination of the soul in death, but also the destination of the shaman who would be able to enter into the other world or the afterlife or whatever they saw it by going through this portal connected with Cygnus, in particular the bright star of Deneb. And one of the other reasons why Deneb was so important, I think, is that from around 16,500 through to 13,000 BC, the stars of Deneb, particularly, the stars of Cygnus, particularly Deneb, were pole star. They acted as pole star. So at this point, for this period of around 3,500 years, at a time when a lot of the cave art was being produced in Europe and around the world, not only was this celestial bird at the point of the pole star spinning round and around each night, but with it would have been the Milky Way, which would have turned around like a propeller on an aircraft from that point. And it would have, each night would have actually come perfectly north-south, which it doesn't do today. Today it's like a sort of rainbow effect, which we see, but it never comes directly overhead, going from north to south, as it would have done every night of every year during that time. And I think that this would have absolutely installed in them the significance not just in the Milky Way, which is variously known as the path of souls, the bird's way, the path of the goose, the swan's way, and things like this in various different cultures, populations around the world, particularly in the area of Russia and Siberia and places like this. That here this is part of a cosmic geography that goes back probably 20 to 30,000 years, that's being inherited by the builders at Gobekli Tepe. And by the way, although I believe that the Swiderians were the inspiration for the creation of Gobekli Tepe, I don't think they actually made it. I think they were the ruling elite, the priestly elite, the shamanic elite behind it, but they probably didn't get their hands dirty. I think that the actual creation of the monuments themselves was put in the hands of the local populations, the peoples that had existed there, for thousands of years. And why were they able to get them to do this? I think because this was a very bad time to have lived, because it was right at the end, not just of the last ice age, but also at the tail end of a massive cataclysm which had affected the world for several hundred years, from around 10,900 through to about 10,300, and possibly even with minor events going on after that, caused by a comet impact initially, and that this had created wildfires around the world, and that these had created this ash clouds that had risen up into the upper atmosphere, darkened the whole planet, blotted out the sun and the moon and the stars for a particularly long period of time, and almost certainly triggered this mini ice age known as the Younger Dryas, which lasted for around 1,300 years. It came on probably within a generation or so, and also ended within a generation or so. And this made all of the ice sheets, which had gradually been going back, because the actual ice age ended about 13,000, 15,000 BC, probably nearer 13,000. And there had been a couple of thousand years where the climate had got warmer again, and the environment was beginning to change, the animals and the plant life and trees, etc. And then suddenly you're plunged back into this mini ice age for 1300 years, a lot of things changed again, particularly migrations, because obviously a lot of peoples who were now living in Northern Europe, everywhere from Britain right the way across to Scandinavia, to the Baltic regions, into Russia, etc. Now, suddenly all of these areas were now under ice again. So all of the peoples had to start moving out and finding new territories where they could settle. There was also massive droughts throughout this period as well that were causing even more problems with famine, and animal migrations changing again, whatever. And I think this is the reason why the Swiderian peoples who occupied what's known as the Central and Eastern European plain started moving south and ended up coming down through the Caucasus region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and then started, entering the regions which were occupied by whoever was already there in Eastern Anatolia and Southeast Anatolia, and that's how they came into contact with these people. And I think that they came in firstly as traders, secondly as shamans and mystics, and possibly even almost messianic figures in a way, because I think they were so advanced. Sure. But more than this, I think that they gave the local populations, who at this point were still suffering from what Barbara Hand Clow referred to in one of her books as catastrophobia, this fear of further cataclysm taking place, that they gave them the remedy of how to stop this. And that was to build these, supersize your cult buildings, start building them in these massive stones, and doing these particular rituals to appease or counter the supernatural forces that were seen as responsible for creating these types of cataclysms associated with comets, which they would have been very much aware that comets were responsible. And comets were seen as associated with supernatural creatures, most specifically wolves and the Arctic fox, and other forms of canine in obviously different areas. So the shaman's job, as it were, at places like Gobekli Tepe was that, when these omens came into the sky, or when they felt that something bad was about to happen, that the shamans would very quickly use these places almost like portals to access the other world and to deal with the problem, and then come back and say, yeah, don't worry, it's all sorted out now, there won't be another cataclysm. I've dealt with the supernatural fox, dealt with the wolf or whatever it is, and you won't have any problems now. And clearly these characters probably would have been wolf shamans or fox shamans as well, which is one of the reasons why the fox and the wolf is actually quite a common symbol that's seen within the carvings, both in relief and in 3D at Gobekli Tepe.
I'm just thinking of Ragnarok, Age of Fire and Gravel, I think it is, by Donnelly, and drawing on the Norse mythology.
Absolutely.
The Swiderians again.
Well, the Swiderians, or what they call the post-Swiderians, that those that came after them, were almost the first peoples entering into Scandinavia, into Finland, into Norway, Sweden, etc. And they would have brought these traditions with them, and their descendants were the shamans, what they're called, the peoples of Finland. I can't remember at the moment. The Same people, and they still have these rituals involving this cosmic pole which links Earth to, the sky world, where they have to do these rituals, sacrifices of reindeer take place, to keep the status quo and to prevent the world from, the time from ending, from the world from, going into complete darkness. They still do those rituals. I certainly did within the last 100 years or so.
These are incredibly interesting times in terms of celestial phenomena, in geography, ice age, migrations, anthropology, from at least from our perspective in a human sense, and looking back at ancient civilization, this is one of the most incredibly interesting times on the planet. It's a pivotal point.
It is, and obviously it's a time that a lot of people associate with Atlantis. Obviously this was Plato's concept of this this island empire in the Atlantic, specifically the Atlantic, he says. that became too haughty, was very advanced, and was then destroyed by Zeus in a single night and day of earthquakes and earthquakes and whatever else it was, waves probably. Anyway, it was destroyed, it sank. And I wrote a book called Gateway to Atlantis in the year 2000, which talked all about this and showed, I believe, that the best candidates by far for the island of Atlantis is Cuba as its flagship, basically, with the former Bahamian landmass, which is now sunken to leave behind all of the archipelagos and islands and whatever that you have today. That this is where it was, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, and that in Plato's time, a lot of these ideas had filtered back into the Mediterranean from early mariners that had got to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, most likely Carthaginians, possibly Phoenicians, who had these very, very secret trade routes to the Americas that were bringing back this knowledge of, the people out there are telling us that, once there was a huge, great landmass and it all got broken up in this cataclysm and the waves came over and whatever. And these reached the ears of Plato. He probably starts discussing them in his philosophical circles and things like that and decides, there's a good story here, and creates these dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, which feature the story of Atlantis. And I think that's how this came about. And the importance here of Atlantis is that almost certainly the comet impact that we're talking about was the same one that destroyed the island land masses of the Bahamas and the Caribbean. And in fact, it's almost certain that some of the larger fragments of this comet probably hit the Atlantic in the area off of the coast, or the east coast of the United States, as is today, and made a hell of a mess of the Bahamas, and probably drowned the populations of the Bahamas and the Caribbean. And that's why we have all these stories about suddenly the waves came in and drowned the islands, and then they went back. But some of the stories talk about them coming then back after that a second time. And this makes sense because first, it's the result of tsunamis, and then the second is the result of the rising of the sea levels after the end of the last ice age, which is exactly what happened. So these places would have been drowned twice, once by tsunamis, once by the sea levels rising, and the final sea level rising would have broken up the land masses completely, and all of this all starts getting mixed together by the time you come to 350 BC. And that's what was the main storyline of Gateway to Atlantis.
So in an Atlantean sense, Plato picked this time frame 9,000 years from his time, so about 9,000 BC.
Yeah.
A credible time to pick.
Yeah.
Smack bang on the
Well, I think he was pretty accurate. I mean, 9,500 BC would certainly be the most obvious time frame for this cataclysm. If it weren't for carbon-14 dating of many of the sites where this thick ash layer has been found around the world. I mean, I was recently in Belgium looking at the so-called, it's called the Usilu Horizon, from the first site that it was discovered in Belgium, but it's now been found in places in Belarus, in Germany, France, and Britain. In America, it's known as the black mat, I think, and even as far as Australia, it's been found. So it shows that the debris of this event, of these wildfires, which were gradually obviously falling back to Earth afterwards, was global. So the dating of this goes back to around 10,900 BC. So that's slightly earlier than what Plato says, but I really don't think we have to worry about this because, nobody knows exactly what dates involved, but I'm pretty certain we're talking about the same event.
They're all very, very close. In that respect then, does the Turkish government or the Antiquity Service, the department there, do they realise the importance of Gobekli Tepe on the global scale? I know there's Western researchers all flock to Gobekli Tepe, and I know you've done a wealth of the whodunit for Gobekli Tepe as well as Gobekli Tepe itself.
Yeah.
And there's anybody who looks at Gobekli Tepe is just fascinated with it, obsessed to the point, myself included. And when you see it, and it's just so sophisticated, but does the Turkish government realise this on the global scale, that it's another Stonehenge, it's another monumental piece of architecture?
They do now. Over the past 5 years, there has been offers of major investment in Gobekli Tepe from private sector in Turkey, and this is being taken up and it's being transformed into an open air museum now. Now, obviously, that is a double-edged sword, really, because it's going to affect what type of archaeology they can do there in the past. In other words, where they can, because if they've got it as a huge tourist attraction, they're not going to be doing any more archaeology at that part. In other words, the enclosures that we see there today. But on the other hand, they're creating a massive new museum at the local nearest city at Şanlıurfa, which is about 8 miles away from Gobekli Tepe. It's going to be second up to the one at Ankara in southern Turkey. So it's going to be a massive thing, I mean, to attract tourists, to obviously go to Şanlıurfa, stay there, go to the museum, and then obviously go out to Gobekli Tepe, see that, and then come back and probably see some other sites like the city of Harran and whatever. So yes, they're very much aware of that. But this is something that's quite new, only within the past few years. And the last time I spoke to Professor Klaus Schmidt before his sad death in 2014, I did sense that there was a change in him, to the degree that I feel he felt that he was losing control of Gobekli Tepe, the place that was his baby, that the world wouldn't know existed if it weren't for him. And he'd done all the great work there, uncovered all these beautiful monuments and become the spokesman for the place. Appeared on television many times talking about the discoveries there. I get the sense that he was beginning to feel that he was losing control of it, and that I wouldn't like to say that that had any connection with his death, but it probably didn't help.
How significant do you think Gobekli Tepe is to humanity, or maybe you could just portray that for what you believe anyway in our research?
Well, I think that Gobekli Tepe, from the point of view of humanity's legacy of the past is concerned, is that this is the smoking gun, really, of high culture, sophisticated culture that existed prior to the last ice age. But, and this is the big but, is that whereas some people out there might see the lost civilization as something out of Plato's Atlantis, huge great cities with crystal wielding, priests in sky blue robes, I don't quite see it that way. I think that there were flowerings of high civilization, or what we'd call civilization, in other words, civilized life around the world. But I don't think it was as obvious as the New Agers like to think it was, and even some of my colleagues, because I think that these high cultures were places like in central Russia, for instance, places like Sungar and Kostenki on the River Don, for instance, where incredible high culture was taking place 30,000 years ago. Everything from agriculture to astronomically aligned longhouses, to sophisticated mother goddess cults, to tailored clothing and lifestyles which, if you looked at them and the images that are there have been recreated online, look like something maybe from the medieval period. And unquestionably, that's the level of sophistication that they had. This to me is the lost civilization that we need to understand. We need to understand why that high culture was there, and I think hybridization is the key.
I want to talk about agriculture, but I also want to focus on this hunter-gatherer concept that we're told who these people were. I don't think hunter-gatherer is a proper label anymore. We have to. Well,
people say to me, hunter-gatherers could not have built Gobekli Tepe. And alone, that's probably correct. The problem is that when it was first started around 9,500 BC, there was nobody else around to do it. I mean, there was only hunter-gatherers, people that hunted. They probably went out seasonally, to follow the herds of animals, a round route that would take them probably a year, possibly even, 2 or 3 years or whatever. And there would be temporary settlement sites that they would remain at and then come back to their base camp. Others would go out, forage, in woods and forests, picking berries and doing whatever else that they wanted to do, with the idea that they would bring back their food to their family unit, possibly a larger social group who would be quite, sort of independent of anybody else, do their thing. They might get together with a few other, social groups once a couple of times a year to celebrate whatever, and that was it. That was all that was there around 9,500 BC. So, what made these people suddenly get off their arses and create these incredible stone monuments? And the only answer comes that they had a common interest, a common goal. And I think that common goal was the fear of cataclysm, the fear of recurring cataclysms, and that when these people came into their midst almost in a messianic way and said, look, we know your problem, we can solve it if you do what we ask of you. And a part of that deal was to create these monuments. And I don't only believe that places like Gobekli Tepe were built for this purpose, that they were multifunctional. They were the first churches, the first cathedrals, the first stone barrows, the first stone circles, if you like. They're multifunctional. But their main purpose was interaction with the other world. They were gateways, quite literally, to the next world.
In the same way, the way we define people in our modern world today, we don't define people by their jobs. I think like the hunter-gatherer of the ancient times was their job, their daily routine, and I think they had flares of Da Vinci-style architecture, if you want to call it that. That's what they did in their spare time.
They did.
They did as an extracurricular activity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have the figure that we call today the shaman, and every community would have had their shaman, I'm sure, male and female. And that these would have been key figures in the way that these people acted on a daily day basis, to do with their rituals, to do with their way of life, whatever, because these were the ones that had this connection with the other world. But I think that it was a regional thing or even a local thing. I don't necessarily think it was part of a national thing. But having said that, there was absolute evidence of trading going on, but long distance trading. So Swiderians, for instance, in the Eastern European plain as far west as Poland, they were right the way across, and the stone traditions, let's say in the Crimea area just to the north of the Black Sea, are identical to what was going on in Poland around 11,000 BC. I mean, it's identical, and it's clearly the same culture, the same people with the same ideas, to such a degree that it could easily be suggested that there were direct networks, trading networks going on. And I think that that's almost certainly what was happening. These people, traded in exotic materials, and that allowed them this understanding of what we would call geography today. They knew where to go. They knew where to find these minerals. They knew where to find things like obsidian, the black volcanic glass, which was incredibly prized. If you want to find answers, follow the obsidian trail, wherever it is in the world, because that was one of the most prized, minerals that you could possess, because it looks like a jewel. When it's carved, it looks like a multifaceted jewel. Nothing is more beautiful than carved obsidian, basically. And these would have been highly prized, and the Swiderians would seem to have been mining that in the area of the Carpathian Mountains. And it would seem that when their territories were compromised, probably during the Younger Dryas period, and they moved south, one of the reasons why I think they entered the area of the Caucasus and further south into what we know today as Armenia and the Armenian highlands is because these were massive sources of obsidian, and they were just attracted to it. I think they were attracted to it, and and then spread out from there. And it's so weird that where those sources of obsidian are is the exact point that you could put your finger down and say this is where the Garden of Eden is located.
Wasn't there an obsidian bracelet found very close to Gobekli?
Yeah.
Do we have any known originator for the people who carved that?
Okay, well, the bracelet you're talking about is so sophisticated that it's suggested that to create it today, and it's like a bangle, it's like a very thick, and sophisticated looking bangle, and that it's a technology which was unknown until this time in southeast Turkey, and it comes from a site called Shikli Hoyak, which is just to the south of the area of Cappadocia, which is where all those beautiful fairy chimneys and underground cities are. In fact, there's an underground city really close to a Shikli Hoyak, and I've been there a couple of times, and it's easy to find pieces of obsidian, and and they're so beautiful. It's absolutely incredibly beautiful, and this bracelet would have been an incredibly prized, high status item, and it dates to about 8,000 BC. Who carved it? Obviously, some local artisan probably, but the technology involved in it is something that clearly would have been built up over thousands of years. And I think that almost certainly it came from Russia, and maybe even further east from central Russia in the Altai Mountains, because the Denisovans, or certainly in the place where the Denisovan remains have been found at the same level, which dates about 40,000 years, they were also creating bracelets which weren't so sophisticated but were getting along the same lines in stone. There's a stone called clitorite, green clitorite, and these were almost as sophisticated, but you can see how that's 40,000 years ago come down to 10,000 years ago. That's 30,000 years to practice and get it perfect. Sure. So there's no reason why it should not be there at Shikli Hoyak in 8,000 BC. They've had plenty of time to practice over the past 30,000 years.
As an engineer, I'm just stupefied how intricately carved that bracelet is. I'm stupefied.
It's incredible, yeah.
In the same, just to focus on the Gobekli Tepe region, let's focus on the agriculture, because I didn't want to step away from that. There's einkorn, the cultivation of wheat, as you say, is actually visible from the location.
That's right.
Visible from Gobekli Tepe.
Now, V. Gordon Childe, a famous prehistorian, wrote many books on the foundations of civilization, suggested that at the end of the last ice age, with the environment changing, it was the right time to change your lifestyle, and that very gradually the domestication of grasses took place, in particular wheat, which was in its earliest form known as einkorn, also rye and barley, and all these sort of things. All this occurred in the area of the Levant, which is the area we now know as sort of Syria and Lebanon, and obviously further north in southeast Anatolia, southeast Turkey. And that once we had this new lifestyle using agriculture, we didn't need to go out and hunt so much, so it gave us this extra time and to ponder over the mysteries of the universe, and we started to construct religious buildings for the first time. Their infrastructure necessitated the construction of communities around them, and hence the first towns and cities. That was the idea of what he referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. We now know that that's entirely wrong. We now know that the religious structures came first, at places like Gobekli Tepe, which would have necessitated hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved with the carving of the stones, the quarrymen, the artisans, the carvers, and the priests, their wives, their children. You'd have been hundreds, thousands of people. All of them would have lived in communities at the base of the mountain. And on top of that, you have the people that are coming to Gobekli Tepe for the presumed rituals and festivals that probably would have taken place there at certain times of the year. And this would have completely depleted the local resources of food very, very quickly. You know, the local animal herds and grasses and, you know, apples from the trees, whatever it was that they were eating out there. I'm not saying there were apples there, but you know, so something had to change very quickly. And I think that a few people said, look, we've been experimenting with that thing called agriculture for a while. Let's bring that in and see if we can, you know, see if we can get that back on track. And I think that's exactly what's happened, because, you know, there had been proto-agriculture on the Nile, for instance, in southern Egypt as early as 13,000 BC. There's evidence of it in Greece, for instance, around similar sort of period, might be slightly later, 12,000, something like that. Plus, we know that the Kostenki culture in central Russia had forms of primitive agriculture as early as 30,000 years ago. That's only been found out in the past few years. But it didn't catch on. You know, clearly the other lifestyle of just doing your own thing, going out, hunting animals, you know, doing the general sort of male testosterone style lifestyle was you know, what we like doing, and we're going to continue doing unless anybody tells us otherwise. And that all changed with Gobekli Tepe. Now it was necessary to have a supplementary form of food to feed everybody. And this is where agriculture really took off. And it's a fact that, as you say, that 68 modern DNA strains of wheat can all be traced back to a single form of wild wheat known as einkorn that grew around 55 miles away, or I should say still grows today, around 55 miles away from Gobekli Tepe. It's on the slopes of what's now an extinct volcano known as Kraja Dar. And you can see it on the northeast horizon on a very, very fine day. So in other words, the genesis point of agriculture, as far as our modern civilization is concerned, was within sight of Gobekli Tepe, and that says a lot.
Genesis for many things, like you say, agriculture, astronomy,
animal domestication,
everything, really.
Metallurgy.
Metsamor isn't too far away either, is it?
Metsamor is a site I've not been to. It's in Armenia, and it would seem to have been a very early place of metal found in foundries.
And megaliths.
And obviously megaliths, yeah. I mean, obviously,
the
I mean, the megaliths themselves are at a site called I can't remember. Anyway, there's a huge, great megalithic site, and that is quite close to Metsamor. Karahunj, that's absolutely right. Karahunj, and Karahunj has been tentatively dated to around 5,500 BC, the earliest activity there. Metsamor probably dates to a similar period, maybe just slightly earlier. There are claims that it goes way, way back, but to be honest, you know, that's not what the academics say, and I'm prepared to stick with them for the time being. From
the last activity then at Gobekli Tepe, is there any? What's the biggest gap in time then to Armenian?
Well, there is no gap, because Gobekli Tepe is up and running by about 9,500 BC. It continues on in one form or another until around 8,000 BC. Around 8,000 BC, you've now got other sites that are taking over, and this includes Karahan Tepe, which is about, I can't remember now, about 30 miles to the east of, or southeast of Gobekli Tepe in the Tek Mountains, still in southeast Turkey. You've got places like Cheonu, which is to the northeast of Gobekli Tepe, not far from the city of Diyarbakir, where you've got more megaliths, but things are slightly more sophisticated here now. You still have alignments, by the way, to Cygnus at Chanu and at Corrihan. And it seems as if a wave of activity has now been created that's gradually going out. At Chanu, you have the earliest evidence of the use of metal. It's lead and beaten copper. It's not actually smelted. Wow. So, and that probably dates to around 7,500 BC. And then very gradually you get the ripple going out, so that you have, let's say, the first smelting going on in northern Iraq and that sort of area. Yeah, still in the same general region, and it's gradually going out. So by the time you hit the area of Armenia with Metsamor and Karahunj, that ripple, is the same culture gradually going out. And then even further north through the Caucasus into the northern Caucasus area, the Russian steppes, you have these thousands and thousands of stone dolmens, sort of with these big stone facades, some of them decorated with these circular holes, these soul holes through, and these infrastructures around them, which have a lot of similarity with the design of the enclosures, the circular enclosures at Gobekli Tepe. In fact, I was looking at one recently, which has got like a big facade stone with a hole through it, with these, huge stone blocks around it, which looks like a mini version of one of the enclosures. But these are dated officially to around 2,000 to 3,000 BC at the very beginning of the Bronze Age. But again, they are likely probably to have a slightly earlier age than that. So in other words, this is the movement out. And if you're looking at Europe, for instance, the movement goes westwards, and you have places like Ashikli Hoyak, which we've mentioned because of this obsidian bracelet. You have the city of Çatalhöyük in southern central Turkey and on the Konya plain. And you have the movement going out to places like Bulgaria, where you have activity 7,000 or 8,000 BC. And then that wave, the first wave during the Mesolithic period, probably reaches all the way out to Britain, where you find at places like Stonehenge these post holes, which once carried massive posts, wooden posts that possibly were aligned from a position of the current location of Stonehenge towards the lunar rises at the different parts of the 18.6 year standstill cycle. And even at Avebury, where I was last week again, where I lived for a period of 5 years, what I didn't realise is that good evidence of Mesolithic activity has been found there to suggest that there was monuments there that also probably go back to the same age as these huge post holes at Stonehenge, therefore around 7,000 or 8,000 BC. So in other words, that wave, that ripple, was the first ripple. But that probably then died away, and that it wasn't then until around 4,000 BC that all of the stone circles and stone chambers, the long barrows and things like that, start to get constructed around, the area of Western Europe. This is the wave, this is the ripple, but it all begins at this cradle of civilization. And the main focus within that cradle is Gobekli Tepe.
Andrea, I could talk about Gobekli Tepe all day. It's such a fascinating, wonderful place. Just one last question to wrap up on that, I guess, because I do want to get to Cygnus and Giza. I want to come back to Cygnus. I've got mixed reports on how it was buried, why it was buried. Tell us about the burying of Gobekli Tepe, this decommissioning, and was there a type of sand used to bury it, or some sort of a composite material?
No.
A lot of speculation about how it was buried or why it was buried.
Well, look, around the world there are many different cultures where after a period of time their ritual sites are buried and something else is constructed over the same site. The most obvious being the Mayans, for instance, of Central America. Their temples are often covered over, and I know one built on top of that, and then 100 years later something else built on top of that. So it's like a layer cake. And that's exactly what you have at Gobekli Tepe. The earliest structures, the biggest and the most sophisticated structures, are built on the bedrock. And they would have functioned for a period of time, let's say 100 years maybe, and then they were decommissioned. So they were covered over, and they were covered over with earth that was brought from the valleys below. They would have been covered over by the stone chips that would have been everywhere, that would have been from the carving of the stones. Bones would have been chucked in there, any rubbish they could find, sort of from their meals and things like this. Anything that they could find to actually cover up. Even human bones were found in there. And then they either built another one to the left or the right, or eventually, once this mound started growing, they built them on top of that. So that now what you've got the sophisticated, incredible monuments at the base, the oldest, and then the youngest, and also, I must state, the more simpler and smaller enclosures are at much higher levels. As much as 15 metres, 45 feet higher is where the younger ones are. So this is a gradual process. This is not something that happened at the last minute, as I know some of my contemporaries have suggested. This did not happen at the last minute.
This sounds like a devolution in design or technology.
It was a devolution, and the same thing happened in Egypt with pyramids, for instance. Obviously, somewhere like the Great Pyramid is the maxim, the absolute of pyramid construction, and it goes downhill after that across the different dynasties. The same thing happened at Gobekli Tepe. The most sophisticated enclosures that they have so far are the oldest ones, and they're incredibly sophisticated. The biggest stones, the best carvings, the most complete structures, like enclosures C and enclosures D. If anybody knows about the layout of Gobekli Tepe, these are the masterpieces. Everything else is from slightly later dates. That seems to be unanimous in the opinions relating to the site. And eventually, they're building these tiny little things which are like miniatures of the big ones, and they're no bigger than the size of a family bathroom. And they have like these benches around them that look like the benches you'd have in a jacuzzi. But they still got the stones, and some of them are even anthropomorphic, with the arms bent round the side. But they're now only about 4 or 5 feet tall, or just a metre and a half tall. Yeah. So that it's almost like they're going through the motions. Sure. And I think that the answer to this is that whatever urgency it was to build this in the first place had now gone. And I think this has got something to do with the fact that the fear of further cataclysms, the catastrophophobia, is now gone.
It's wearing off.
It's where it's gone. But do remember, this is like a Christian church. The earliest Christian churches, let's say they were constructed, let's say 400 or 500 AD. We're still manufacturing them today. We're still putting the altars in the east. We're still having images of Christ and the Virgin Mary on a cross within them or whatever. If we follow the design, even though it's shifted across the years, in some ways it's become more exotic, in some ways it's become more simplified, but we're still doing the same thing. And the same thing occurred at Gobekli Tepe over exactly the same period of time, 1,500 years, from 9,500 BC to 8,000. But by the time they came to 8,000, we're dealing with structures that are small, simpler, and it looks like they're going through the motions. And I think that also the other important thing is that the orientation had changed by the end. There is clear evidence, which people like Klaus Schmidt and others have noticed, that the later monuments are aligned towards the sun and not towards anything else, like north-south, towards stars in the north or stars to the south, as some of my colleagues might suggest. Now they're being orientated specifically towards the equinoxes or the solstices. So why the change from stellar observations and lunar, I would point out, to sun? And the answer is simple. Now they've got agriculture. Now the most important thing to them is the ripening of the crops each year, and for that you need the sun. So the sun has become the main focus of attention for their religious beliefs, which is why they've now started to switch their attentions of the alignments of their monuments towards the rising and or setting of the sun.
Perhaps a better way to say would be devolution in technology, but evolution in culture simultaneously.
If you like, I mean, obviously, you know, things are developing. We're beginning to get things like, you know, metallurgy, obviously animal domestication as well, went on in this area. You know, cows, pigs, sheep, goats, all of these were first domesticated in this region for the first time around the time of Gobekli Tepe. Go on.
Yeah, well, Andrew, I want to touch on. We're going to come up for the last topic, I guess. I want to touch on Cygnus at Giza, specifically, and the caves.
Of course,
well. It's one of the most exciting things that has come out of Egypt in recent times. For the audience, let's talk about Rodney Hale and the Orion theory.
Yeah.
I know you're friends with Robert Bovell. I know you've collaborated with
course.
Robert.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Robert's theory of the Orion and Rodney Hale and how that all kind of comes about.
Yeah. Well, I think, wasn't it 1983 I would give... Sorry, 1993 for the publication of The Orion Mystery by Robert Bovell and Adrian Gilbert. Yeah. This was a book that changed my life. I mean, there's no question about that. It was about ancient Egypt, but this guy was not an academic, but he was coming up with the most revolutionary new ideas about the astral religion, the sky religion of the ancient Egyptians. And he was suggesting that the pyramids were positioned to reflect the astronomical positions of the three stars of Orion, and that Orion was seen as like the entrance point to the other world, and that it was a place mentioned in the pyramid text as where Orion, which is the form that the pharaoh takes in death, goes to, and that if you were to overlay the stars, the three stars of Orion's belt over the three pyramids, they match, and that's the reason why they were put into this particular geographic arrangement on the ground. That was the basic thing, the so-called Orion correlation theory, and I loved it. I thought it was a fantastic idea. But my colleague, who's a chartered engineer, Rodney Hale, who had been working in the ancient mysteries subject for many years and was first involved in things like, for instance, the Dragon Project with Paul Devereaux and the Lay Hunter magazine in the late 1970s, early 1980s. He made all of the instruments that they used to detect anomalous readings of energies and things like that. And, he's an incredible person. And he doesn't just take things as read when he reads them. He will go away and check it out. So what he did was to get, a good picture of the three stars of Orion, as viewed through any camera lens, and overlay them on the pyramids and just see if they did actually match. And they don't. You can put two of the stars over the summits of pyramids 1 and 2, the Great Pyramid and Second Pyramid, which you can do stretch in any way you want, and the third one doesn't even hit the third mark of the third pyramid. Now, the problem here is that if there is so much sophistication in the alignment of let's say the Great Pyramid towards true north, which is within a very small fraction of a few minutes of degrees of azimuth or whatever, why would they get it so wrong? As far as why would they get it so wrong if they were just trying to arrange the three pyramids? I mean, surely they would have found a way of working out the accuracy. And this bugged him for years. I mean, and I remember him telling me about it originally. He actually wrote a small report, which I think I've still got somewhere on it, and he sent it to me. And then in 2004, I visited Gobekli Tepe, came back. Cygnus started becoming a big thing in my life. I was beginning to find alignments towards Cygnus all over the world, in Ireland, for instance, to do with Newgrange and its accompanying site of Four Knocks. And Rodney Hale, asleep one night in January 2005, so it's just a few months later, suddenly had this sort of epiphany moment, if you like, where he was thinking about this Cygnus, which obviously I was interested in now, the stars of Cygnus, and he wondered what would happen if you put the three basic wing stars of Cygnus in its form of a bird over the three pyramids. Would those three stars correspond to the exact geographical placement of the three pyramids? And in his mind, he convinced himself that this would be at least pretty accurate. So he got up the next morning and went straight to his computer, found a good picture of Cygnus, got the three stars, overlaid them on the pyramids 1, 2 and 3 at Giza, matched absolutely perfectly. Absolutely perfectly. And he sent this over to me, again as a little report as he does, later that day. And I just thought, oh no. Because seeing this was incredible in one hand, but if I was to include this in this upcoming book, which I was now beginning to write, that would be the Cygnus mystery.
Bombshell time.
It would be bombshell time, because it would immediately put me at loggerheads with not only Robert Bouval, who was a friend of mine I've known for a great many years and supported him in his work, but also obviously with the believers in the Orion correlation theory, of which there are tens of thousands or more around the world, and they believe in it very fervently, almost like a religion as well these days. So I realised that I would not only have to double check and triple check this, but also to find a good context, because that was the important thing. The context is okay, just finding some stars that might align to the pyramids. You just pluck them out of thin air and just put them all. Look, these work better. You need the context. What was Cygnus so important to the ancient Egyptians? And it has various significances, but the key one is the fact that it would appear that its role overlaid upon the Milky Way was the key here, because it was at the exact point where the Milky Way breaks into two to form two separate branches, and that the area in the middle is known as the Great Rift. It's like an area of stellar dust and debris that causes a dark area down the centre of the Milky Way. Now, to the ancient eye, when they saw the Milky Way of the Northern Hemisphere arched over the Earth, this became a goddess, and this goddess was known as Nut, spelled N-U-T. Mm-hmm. And she was the sky goddess. She was the mother of Osiris. She was the mother of the sun god Ra, or Re. And another one of her forms was the goddess Hathor, whose cult is interlinked. And Hathor was the mother of of other key gods anyway. But coming back to Nut, there are a lot of references to the fact that in death, the deceased returns back to the womb of his mother, and that the sarcophagus, the coffin, the tomb, and the pyramid itself is a representation, a physical representation of the womb of the mother of the pharaoh, or obviously other figures during later periods who became embroiled in the same religious beliefs. So, in other words, by entering inside the sarcophagus and the tomb and the coffin, they were all basically ways for the deceased to ascend back to the cosmic womb where he or she were considered to have come from in the first place. And a American astronomer by the name of Dr. Ronald Wells had realised that if you overlay the image of Nut on the Milky Way as it appears in the Northern Hemisphere, the area of her womb and her vulvar area are exactly overlaid with the position of Cygnus, and that the two streams that are formed by the Great Rift form her legs, and that the tradition about the sun being swallowed by Nut each night and passing through her body and being reborn from between her loins every morning, a thing that was played out not only daily but also in yearly rituals to do with the solstices, was a rebirth from Cygnus, and that the sun therefore would then fall symbolically between her legs, i.e. down the dark rift, and be reborn where her legs or feet meet the horizon, which is the point known as the ecliptic, the path of the sun where it crosses the Milky Way. In other words, it was this symbolic process of being rebirthed in Cygnus. So in other words, there's every good reason why the three pyramids at Giza should actually be aligned to Cygnus. Every good reason. So I put all this in the Cygnus mystery, and of course the bombshell did hit inevitably, and it caused at one point a back and forth between Robert Bouval and myself, who was trying to obviously denounce the Cygnus connection with not just Giza but with Egypt, ancient Egypt in total. It amounted to something like over 60 pages, and if you go on to andrewcollins.com or go into Google and Andrew Collins, Robert Bouval, Orion, Cygnus, it'll all come up, and it's still up there today. And I think I held my ground pretty well, and that obviously I went on to write about the same subject in future books. For instance, Beneath the Pyramids in 2009 that came out. It's mentioned obviously in other books as well. But the significance here of all of this was that it eventually led to the discovery of the cave, the lost cave world at Giza. Specifically, if I'd have not got onto the Cygnus correlation at Giza, it would not have been discovered.
How strange, really.
And the reason for this is that the three wing stars of Cygnus overlaid on the three pyramids. But there was the bright star Deneb that was not seemingly marked by a pyramid. Well, you'd think that they wouldn't just have the three wing stars and forget Deneb. There must be something. So I began to look at what I began to refer to as the Deneb spot. In other words, the place on the plateau where Deneb would have fallen. And it actually falls in the area known as the Western Cemetery. And it marks what's known as a mastaba tomb there, which was looked at in the 19th century by a German archaeologist by the name of Lepsius. But it's nothing special, to be honest. I mean, you look at it and think, well, that doesn't mean anything, to be honest. But it focused me in on that area of the Western Cemetery, because very close to it is the northern cliff face. Just beyond there is the northern cliff face of the plateau itself, and it runs along there. And my colleague Nigel Skinner-Simpson, who was aware of my interest, and we shared, new discoveries at Giza, on old maps and things like this, came round one day and he showed me an old map I'd not previously seen by a engineer who worked with Professor Colonel Howard Weiss in the mid-1800s at Giza. And this map was by his engineer friend called John Perrin. And very close to the Deneb spot was a little mark that said pits and tombs of bird mummies.
Wow.
And I remember looking at this and thinking, I've never ever come across that before in my life. So we looked and we found one entry from Howard Weiss that said, that clearly seemed to relate to this location, but you wouldn't have been able to find it otherwise. And it said something like, today we worked in this tomb. There are some galleries, and we found that the mummy of a large bird removed it. That's all it said. So it was clear that these pits and tombs were being used as a place for some kind of bird cult. Well, bird is the principal creature associated with Cygnus, and even at that point I began to think, I just wonder whether this might lead into some kind of underground cave system. That was my thought, even at that point. Mm-hmm. And because this is almost what I'd thought the Deneb spot was going to mark. So we looked for more information, couldn't find anything, but I thought I've got to go to Egypt and check this out. So we went into what I began to refer to as the Tomb of the Birds, which was entered via the North Cliff. Now, the reason why nobody knows anything about this is because it's at the extreme northwestern corner of the plateau, several hundred yards from the Great Pyramid. And also there was a building there very close by that was a presidential building. I say presidential, it's not that big, which was used by President Mubarak when he wanted to get away from his home in Cairo, his offices. He would fly out to the edge of Giza Plateau and the helicopter would come down and land. I remember seeing it quite a few times, and he would get out, spend a few hours there and go back home to Cairo. So in other words, it was out of bounds. You couldn't go over that area. This was a presidential area. It was, guarded. So no one ever went over there. Tourists did not go in this area of the plateau, and probably never have done, really, or certainly not in modern times. So I went there with my ex-wife. We looked inside. It was very mysterious, very interesting. There are like slots in the walls where clearly bird mummies would have been placed. But it's a tomb. There was nothing else mentioned about it anywhere, but it was just a tomb. Came away from there. This was in 2007 now. And later on that year, Nigel Skinner-Simpson came back to me again and said, I found something else. You're going to like this. It's the diary notes of a guy called Henry Salt.
Yeah.
Now, Henry Salt was the Consul General to Egypt, the British Consul General to Egypt, around 1819, 1820, that sort of period. He was a collector of Egyptian antiquities, and he didn't generally get his hands dirty. He employed the services of other adventurers, mostly, these big Italians, Belzoni and various other, these characters, like called Caviglia or whatever. And he found reference in these diary notes, which had only just been published for the first time, that of a report from Salt saying, we entered into cave catacombs today, went for a distance of several hundred yards. My colleague Caviglia went on a further few hundred yards, and we found this and that. It was full of bones and bits and pieces, whatever. And Nigel said, this is unrecorded. He said, I'm familiar with most of the material ever written about the Giza Plateau. And this, whatever this location is totally unrecorded. And I said, well, where is it? And he said, well, Salt refers you to a place on his map that he'd drawn of the different sites he'd been on the plateau to area QQ. But he said there's a problem, because the map that he drew is very archaic, and he starts with A, goes to B and C and whatever, and then finally goes on to double letters, AA, BB, CC, etc., etc. And initially, QQ doesn't seem to appear anywhere. And in fact, the people that published the diaries of Salt, who worked for the British Museum, Manley and Usak, in a book called The Sphinx, I think it was Unveiled or something like that, Revealed or something, said, we've looked for area QQ, can't find it, but we think it's somewhere over to the north of the Great Pyramid. Guessed. They couldn't find it. What Nigel did was he went through the entire map and crossed off every single point, and matched it against every site that. So A, we've done that, C, F, D, until eventually, in theory, he should only be left with one place, wow. QQ, and finally he hit it northwest of the plateau. And the reason why Usak and Manley had missed it is because it's written as 2-2, where it's the old way of writing a Q. It was like a 2.
Wow.
And when I saw the location of QQ, I just said that's the Tomb of the Birds. It's got to be the Tomb of the Birds. And I said, I wouldn't jump to conclusion. I said, that's the Tomb of the Birds. I tell you now, it's the Tomb of the Birds. And we've missed it. We've missed the entrance into the cave system. we've got to go back. And we went back the following March, which in 2008. Myself, my ex-wife Sue, and Nigel Skinner-Simpson, and we went back into the Tomb of the Birds, and this time, bear in mind it's totally dark in here, this is why we missed it first time. We found a small crack within this tiny doorway which had been bricked up, and we peered inside there, and there was a massive cave chamber, 12, 15 metres across, as much height, and full of fallen debris. And I just thought, that's it, we found it. This is the entrance into the cave system. And that was, what I call my Howard Carter moment, basically. And I remember going back to the hotel that night after we'd gone into it, but not penetrated it very deeply that first day. And I wrote to John Van Alken, who was the director of the Edgar Cayce Foundation, who helped, finance our trip over there. And I remember writing him an email just sort of saying, found wonderful things or words to that effect. Sort of replicating almost what Howard Carter had said to Lord Carnarvon, when they first looked inside Tutankhamun's tomb. And it felt like that. I mean, that was my Howard Carter moment, I think. I don't think, anything else will have that same impact on my life.
It's incredible, the list of detail that had to happen. The Boval Orion theory, the Rodney Hale.
I know.
The British keeping records going back that far. That's what the British do well. And Nigel Skinner-Simpson being such a hell of a researcher to find it.
And yet the strange thing is that if all this had happened 2 years later, it wouldn't have happened, because obviously you had the whole Arab Spring thing in 2010 there, and the security completely all changed, and it was almost impossible now to get onto the plateau. We would not have been able to take the right equipment, all the rest of it, which we were able to, say surveying equipment. It wasn't. It was just basic stuff which we had, which we just wanted to, record whatever we could, and we used camels to get onto the plateau because that was the easiest way of getting on there without being searched at the time. But that loophole is now gone. You can't do that anymore.
I'm going to refer people and the viewers at this point to Lost Case of Giza DVD. I believe you can get that on andrewconnell.com.
Yeah, you can, but in all honesty, I'm not detracting business to my website. You can actually watch it on YouTube. If you just put Lost Caves of Giza, just have a look at the whole thing on there. It's over an hour long. It's got all the original footage plus reconstructions that my good friend Greg Little instigated. It's fantastic DVD, which is now obviously an online documentary, and nearly 1 million people have watched that. That shows the interest in this subject.
How do you feel now, Andrew? Do you feel you should have really pushed to go back further? Could you have done any more?
We went into the caves 4 times, each time penetrating deeper and deeper. Eventually, after what was only, it sounds like only that the difficulty we had to get to this point were insurmountable almost, but we got to a distance which is probably between 100 and 150 metres into the actual cave system itself. And eventually, you sort of slide through from the main thing into a separate chamber, and now it all shrinks down into what we call the tube, which is no more than about 2 feet across and tall, and it's round. Probably the product of the water that flowed through there at some point, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. And you would have had to have gone through there. Now, firstly, at this point, we were beginning to realise that the air was getting so stifling and so carbon monoxide based that it was beginning to affect us. And secondly, there were big bugs up there, and the previous day my ex-wife had actually seen the spiders which we'd identified online the night before as white widows, which if you get bite by them, you're in trouble. And we actually felt that it was best at this point to leave it and come back at a later point before going on any further. We'd come far enough, but now I wish we had have gone further on. The follow-up this was in 2008. 2 years later, Zahi Hawass, who we'd eventually gone to see to report all of this, the guy in charge of the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt, he initially denies the whole thing, both publicly and in front of myself and my ex-wife. But then we see him on the TV reality show chasing mummies inside the caves, getting right to the end of the tube and saying this is the most incredible experience he'd ever had at Giza. Extraordinary. By the way, this place was full of hundreds and thousands of bats as well, flying at you all the time.
I think the worst conditions you would want to explore a cave, it wasn't there.
And bones everywhere, bones, skulls, bones. It was just, and fallen rocks. I mean, you could break a leg with every move in the total darkness. And yeah, because there was rocks that had obviously fallen down probably during earthquakes from above that were all on the floor. So you had to try and navigate all of these. So it wasn't just a case of easy passage from the start to the end. There were various other turnings and places that needed exploring as you went on. But the one thing I will say is that at the end of Chasing Mummies, they said they sent one of their guys up the tube and he came back after having gone about 10, 15 metres and said, no, it doesn't go any further. But I can tell you now that it does continue. Yeah. I know it does.
Wow. It almost sounds like an Indiana Jones movie in a way.
Well, it's, I mean, if you're in this business, you've got to, get out in the field and do something. You cannot just write books sitting at a table and not go to the places you write about. Not everyone. I mean, quite clearly you just wouldn't be able to afford it and you wouldn't have the time. But if you're talking about key sites, you need to explore and investigate them. That's what I've done with Gobekli Tepe. That's what I've done with Cuba, for instance, going out to cave structures out there that I felt, may even record that the cataclysm. Bahamas, Native American. I was climbing mountains in West Virginia last year looking for evidence of the American giants, the Nephilim, the ruins that they might have left behind. I've been all over the world, and I'll continue to do so. I mean, the next place I need to get to is Java in Indonesia because of this place Gunung Bedang, which has been investigated recently. It's a pyramid-like hill with megalithic structures on tiers going up to its summit, generally dated to around 2500 BC, i.e. the Bronze Age, now thought to be possibly 10 times as old, possibly as far back as 24,000 years. Wow. And that it could well have been up and running in a megalithic complex at the same time as Gobekli Tepe. Wow. Need to get out there. Shall be writing about it, obviously. Some of my contemporaries have already been there, so I need to be there as well. But I don't just want to look at that. I want to go amongst the people of Java, looking at their folklore, their legends, their myths, to see what they might tell us about who could have been behind the construction of this monument, and to see if there was actually a lost civilization there and put in the whole jigsaw together. That's what I want to do. I don't just want to go to the site and come back and report and say, yeah, it's a groovy place. I want to know why it's there.
What an incredibly prolific researcher, Andrew. Please take a moment to give out your website and also tell us a little bit about the Origins Conference that you put on every year. Will you do another one this year?
We'll see. I mean, obviously I can't say it will, but obviously we had the Origins 13, Origins 14. Let's see if we will have an Origins 15. But my website is www.andrewcollins.com, and obviously lots of books available. Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods was my last proper book, but do get Path of Souls by Greg Little with the contributions by myself. Because that's causing a lot of debate relating to the Denisovan hybrids being the American giants. And that's only come out recently as well. And as I said, writing about human hybrids now, and I think that's where I'm be going for the future years, I think.
I really wish you every success with the forthcoming hybrids book. I really can't wait to read that one, Andrew. I thank you for your time today. It's been awesome.
It's my pleasure.